All right. Okay, so the first thing is to make sure that you take your quiz by midnight tonight if you haven't already. The second thing is that we're going to begin chapter 4, which is on physical developments during infancy and toddlerhood. And then the third thing is your first exam will be this week on chapters 1 through 4. So there won't be a quiz, there'll be an exam on chapters 1 through 4. Same timeline. It'll be it'll open up Friday at 4 and close Monday at midnight. Now I have to go back to the attendance because Zach just joined us. Zach gets here when Zach wants to get here. All right. Okay. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to start chapter 4. Does anyone have any questions? Does anyone have anything that they need to address? Okay. Fabulous. Okay. Physical development in infancy and toddlerhood. All right. So we identify infancy as the first year. And then once you reach the second year, you're into your toddlerhood. Rapid changes in the body and brain that support learning, motor skills, and perceptual capacities. The motor, perceptual, cognitive, and social development mutually influence one another. So as one develops, it influences the other. So as our motor develops, motor movements, our physical movements develop, so do it impacts our cognitive development as well, that sort of thing. So when a child walks, it, the hands are free for exploring and interacting with the physical world. So as there's this physical development of ability of walking, you're able to explore more. All right. All right. Body growth. So there's faster growth than at any other time, and these things occur in spurts. So when you are first born, the average height or length, I guess, would be 20 inches long. The average weight is about 7.5 pounds. By the end of your first year, there's a 50% over a 50% increase. So the average length or height is 32 inches, and our weight just about triples to 22 pounds. By the end of the second year, we are an average of 36 inches. So that's 75% greater than at birth. And then our weight is at about 30 pounds, which is 4 times. We already addressed how we develop our motor skills in a cephalocaudal. Cephalo means head, caudal means tail, so a head to tail. So the head develops more rapidly than the lower part of the body, which makes sense because you need to be able to move your head in a coordinated fashion so you can feed and attend to things and look at things. And we also develop an proximo-distal trend that's near to the midline to the far extremities. So growth proceeds from the center of the body outward. That allows us to roll over before we're able to, grasp things and pinch things. That sort of. So we have growth norms. Think of norms as short for normal. So growth averages. So these are the height and weight averages. We do see some gender and ethnic differences. A lot of them are due to how we are raised. A lot of them are genetic. Um, like you would see the gender differences um, being more genetically influenced, but some of the ethnic differences, which we're going to address later, um, are more often than not environmentally influenced. So individual variation due to many factors, such as even nutrition. And the best way to tell what the age of an individual is by looking at their skeletal age or determining their skeletal age, looking at their bones. All right, so the nervous system made up of neurons. These are nerve cells that store and transmit information. In what form are they transmitting information? What are they actually giving each other? Anyone? How are they communicating? I know it's Monday morning.
Through the synapses?
Correct. The synapse is the point at which they communicate. And what is traveling across the synapse?
Electrical impulses.
Electrical impulses are limited to the nerve cell itself, but they're not passing electricity from one to the next. They are passing something.
Hormones. Like
Chemicals?
chemical signals.
Chemicals, and those would be the neurotransmitters, right? Okay, these are the chemicals that are released by neurons that send the message across the synapse. The synapse are the tiny gaps between the neurons where fibers from different neurons come close together but do not touch. And that's not entirely true. We have, and you're going to learn this in nursing, I'm sure, neuromuscular junctions where they actually do touch. And Patrick, in this case, they actually are using electricity, not just chemicals. They're also using electrical impulses. So the nerve fibers will attach themselves to the nerve fibers will attach themselves to the muscle cells, causing them to constrict. And then when they stop exciting them, they relax. So the development of neurons, there's the establishment of unique functions by forming these synaptic connections with neighboring cells. We have programmed cell death, which is good. That's what we need, where neurons die to make space for new connective structures. Stimulation is vital for the survival of a neuron and the formation of a new synapse. So, you know the saying, if you don't use it, you lose it. Synaptic pruning returns seldom stimulated neurons to an uncommitted state. What does it mean? It means that the neuron didn't die. It's just that the synapse that had formed between it and another or several other neurons, it pulls its axon terminals or dendrites, depending on which, if it's retrograde or anterograde, it'll pull parts of its body essentially back to no longer communicate and just wait to be used for something else. And if it doesn't get used, then eventually it'll die. Myelination. You've heard of the myelin sheath that covers like a sheath, like a sword. It's like the scabbard. So it covers, it protects, it speeds up, it prevents the electrical charge from escaping from its axon. So it serves many functions, but it's this coating of fat cells, and it's a specific kind of glial cell, which we call like the helper cells for the nervous system. And this glial cell is a fat cell called myelin. It improves the efficiency of the message transfer. So what does that mean? It means that it makes the electrical charge traveling down the axon move faster because it can skip. Like it's a good example. I never thought of this just now. When you skip stones across the water and it jumps. Well, think of how much faster the stone gets from A to B by jumping instead of trying to travel all along the water. Right? It would slow it down, hitting all the pieces of the water. So that's how the myelin sheath works. You'll have the axon, then you have like a myelin cell wrapping around it, and then another one around it next to it, and then another one all the way. So it looks like a bunch of arm floaties just next to each other on the axon. And so the electrical charge skips where the fat cells are, where these myelin cells are. And so because it skips, it makes the electrical charge travel faster. So glial cells that are responsible for myelination account for half the brain's volume. And they multiply rapidly in the first 2 years. So the reason why brains smell so bad when we die is because it's mostly fat. And if it weren't fat, if it weren't all for all this myelin, then anytime we move our head, we'd be hurting our neurons, we'd be damaging them. So they act as like a cushion. So let's see, they're showing you the major milestones of brain development. So as the brain, so the or y-axis, so as the brain grows, they're showing you going up, and then over age, over time, the on the x-axis, you can see where synapses are formed in the green. They're looking at the auditory and visual areas of the cerebral cortex. In the blue, the language areas of the cerebral cortex, and then in the pink, the prefrontal cortex, which is our, executive function in the front, helps us make decisions, responsible for making decisions. And then everything in the yellow that they're showing you, with the green, with the blue, with the red, they're just showing you where the myelin comes into play also. That production of myelin. So all the negatives are prenatal period. Then you have 0, which is birth. Then you have months, and then you hit years, 1, 2, up until death. So what you can see is the number of synapses being formed. Now this is where new connections are being made between neurons. The number of synapses formed for our senses, in this case it'd be perceptual abilities, but because it's in the brain. So when it comes to sound and sight and language development, these connections are massively growing just in the first year. Just getting it ready, this organizational effect. And then you can see slowly, or slower, but longer lasting, are the problem solving, the reasoning part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex in the pink. So it's showing you essentially that the majority of our connections being made for sight, sound, and language development are in the first year of life. Again, it's this organizational. It's organizing the brain to get it ready for toddlerhood and childhood, so we can actually learn the language and use language and express and receive language. But again, the problem solving region, the prefrontal cortex, the control center, meaning the decision making place, this is drawn out, right? It doesn't really even drop until third year of life or so. Then it starts to slowly drop. So how can we measure the function of the brain, or the activity of the brain? We can use an EEG, an electroencephalograph, graphing the electrical activity in your head, essentially picking up on action potentials, which is the neuron firing. So when we're picking up on an action potential, we're detecting minute changes in electrical charge inside of your brain. Is it becoming more or less positively charged? So the more positively charged a region is, it suggests that neurons are firing in that area. We can use what are called event-related potentials, and that's simply doing basically the same thing, but what we're doing is we're associating them with an event, with an experience, with a sound, with a sight, with a taste, with a touch, some sort of stimulus that we want to see what part of the brain is associated with that. What part of the brain responds to that stimulus. We can use, if we want to know what the actual, not so much the function alone, but now the structure of it as well. So for imaging purposes, because that's just looking at electrical activity. That's just saying where something is happening. It doesn't show us the structure of the brain, just that this region is lighting up. We can use an fMRI. So a functional magnetic resonance imager is where they're going to essentially look at oxygen levels of the brain to determine where blood is pooling. And then at the same time, we're getting a 3D image back using magnetism, I guess, for lack of better words. Or we can use a PET scan. And so essentially what you're doing with this one is that you're putting a radioactive dye into the blood, and it's got sugar with it. And so wherever the blood goes, the radioactive dye will light up under a scanner. And we can find out where blood is pooling for a general function, like, I don't know, sleeping, where's the blood going when they're sleeping? When they're feeding, where's the blood going when they're feeding? That kind of thing. And the sugar is important because neurons will use the sugar when they're firing. They need energy, right? So if you have a function like, I don't know, solving a math problem, and you're using specific neurons for like analytical reasoning or mathematical deduction in your right hemisphere or whatever, blood's going to pool there because neurons are going to be firing and they're going to need more energy. They're going to need more, juice. So the cerebral cortex and the cortical regions, the cerebral cortex is the largest brain structure. It surrounds the rest of the brain. Then you have inside that the midbrain. That's like, here's the cortex, here's the midbrain, then you have the brainstem, or the hindbrain, whatever you want to call it. The cortical regions develop as capacities emerge. The first year, we have the auditory and visual cortices. Well, they're not really the cortices. They are the cortices. They are, regions responsible for these perceptual abilities. Another one, the frontal lobe, we have the primary motor cortex. We're going to look at all this in a second. Infancy through preschool, we have the language that's going to be in the temporal lobes, specifically the left temporal lobe. Now the prefrontal cortex, that's the most front part, responsible for complex thought, functions more effectively from the age of 2 months on. So here we're looking at the lobes, and then particular cortices, which is cortex plural, for association areas. So we have in the back green here, we have the occipital lobe, and then the back part of it is the primary visual cortex. Then in the purple here, we have the temporal lobe and then at the top left, or just you can see the topmost portion, is the auditory cortex. Now this is just a left hemisphere, so we have pairs of them, one on the left, one on the right. In the pink, we have the parietal lobe, and in the very, very frontmost portion of it is what's called the somatosensory cortex for touch. And then here in the blue, this large portion here is the frontal lobe, and in the back in the middle, meeting up against the somatosensory, is the primary motor cortex for movement. And then the front part of it is the prefrontal cortex, and here is where we have problem solving, thinking, complex things. Any questions about this? This was taught to you in 101, but it's been a while for many of you. What would I ask you? I would ask you to know what each cortex is responsible for. So if the visual cortex, vision, right? The somatosensory for body sensation, doesn't say somatosensory, but that's what it's called, for touch. The primary motor, and I'm pointing to it like you can see, I would know that is for movement. The auditory for sound. I would know what the 4 lobes are: frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. It might be a question like, which below is not one of the 4 lobes of the brain or something. So lateralization is a term that we use to describe functions being highly specialized to one side or the other of the brain, to one hemisphere or the other. So the left hemisphere is for sequential analytic processing. It does not mean that the right hemisphere is not involved. It just means that when you damage the left hemisphere, you see severe deficits, not partial. Hey, Turi.
Hi. Sorry, I slept in my alarm.
That's okay. That's okay. So it says left hemisphere verbal communication. So that means language and language production and language comprehension in the left hemisphere. positive emotion. So happiness, I don't know, contentedness. Right hemisphere, holistic integrative processing, making sense of spatial information and regulating negative emotion. Interestingly, one of the sexes has the left hemisphere larger than the right, and the other one has the left and the right the same size. Does anybody want to guess which of the sexes has the left hemisphere larger than the right?
Was it women?
Correct. Why would you say that? Why did you say what? Why was that your
I'm
guess?
just reading under what it says under left hemisphere. It just sounds more like a women's attributions, like because women are more sympathetic and empathetic, I think, and it's easier for them to have like emotions and not be as vulnerable.
I think it's because like when you like it goes back to like when we were like cavemen and stuff. Women were responsible for your rearing the kids and stuff, so it required they required to have like more empathy and sympathy and positive and good verbal communication
Good.
because they would run the households and stuff.
Good.
And like I think it has something to do with that.
Very good. Good. I loved that you brought up our ancestry, because you're not just saying these are differences that we see today, which they are, but this is why. Here's the function. Here's the purpose. Here was the pressure for it. Very good. And was it Sage that spoke first?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good job with the positive emotion and tying in sympathy and empathy. Good job with that. Plus, you could also think, well, if the left hemisphere is larger than the right hemisphere, then that means it's taking up more cranial space. So there's a sacrifice in the right hemisphere. And the thing that might stand out to some of us, going back again to our ancestry, look at the middle bullet or the middle point here, making sense of spatial information. How would that would have been something that would have benefited the males? So it's lower in our ancestry. It would be a lower need for that spatial information, understanding, comprehension. What does that mean? It means like understanding where things are in space. Okay.
Would it have to do with hunting?
Exactly. Yes, that's exactly right. Very good. So these are, well done. These are remnants from our ancestry. Now, and I'll say this, and I've been saying this, these differences aren't necessary any longer. They're not. But the fact of the matter is, there were differences that were necessary in order for our species to survive. We look at non-human animals. Let's just look at like wolves, right? Who's in charge when there's a wolf pack? The males or the females? The males or the females?
The male.
No, the females.
Oh, the female.
Yeah. They're the bosses. They're the ones that lead. They're the ones that take care of business. Look at let's say a lions. Whatever you call that. A pack again? I don't even know what they would call that. What do they call that? Pride.
Pride.
Yeah, pride. What happens there? What is a division of labor between the males and the females? Who hunts?
Females.
That's right. That's right. And why do you suppose that is?
Why do the females hunt?
Yeah. Why not the males?
Well, the male's job is basically to look intimidating and keep away animals that could be threatening towards the pride. So I don't really see a good reason for it, but I mean, I don't see why the male can't get out there and hunt too, but I mean, still be intimidating, but energy conservation, maybe. I mean, if he gets wounded, he can't protect the pride sort of a thing, but
Okay. Okay. Who is a stronger animal? A female lion or a male?
male,
Male.
yeah.
But yet you have these females that are going out and hunting in packs. Meanwhile, the
Hmm.
male's staying back and just kind of roaming around. And what is it doing? It's keeping all other males away. Keeping other, like you said, the visual appearance of the male is terrifying in comparison to the female.
Mhm.
So the reason why these things have evolved to be is, again, think of what the male's job is: to roam around and keep other males away. The male lions cannot work together. They will fight more over the females than they will go fight to hunt. So their species relies on the females being able to coordinate, to cooperate, because the
Well, that makes
males
sense,
cannot.
yeah.
Yeah, see,
Yeah.
there's a function. It serves a purpose, and they benefited from it. They benefited from it. They survived because of it. It's nuts, right? It's when you really think about all the different strategies that different species of animals have developed over time to survive. It's crazy. Birds are weird too. Birds are nuts. Rodents are nuts. It's great though. That's why I would love to teach an animal behavior course. I'd love to show you it's called comparative animal behavior, where you see different designs, different strategies for survival, different functions, all that. It's great. All right. Well done, everyone. That was good. Okay, brain plasticity. Again, plasticity means change. Okay. So the brain's ability to change, adapt. So at birth, the hemispheres have begun to specialize. They're highly plastic, the highly plastic cerebral cortex during the first few years. Many areas are not yet committed to specific functions. So there's a high capacity for learning, and the early experiences influence the brain's organization. There's that word, organizational effects, setting it up. It's it's setting up. If you remember that one graph where it showed you the visual and the auditory and the language cortices, how the synapses are formed early on. It's setting it up. No 1-year-old is having a full-blown conversation with anyone, right? At best, they'll babble by the end, but they're setting it up to be activated in the next coming years. So if a part of the cortex is damaged, other areas can take it over. So our ability to adapt, or plasticity, depends a lot on the age at the time of injury. So if there hasn't been any specialization of a region for, I don't know, math or language, or if it hasn't been yet designated, if it hasn't yet been specialized, other parts of the brain will take over easier than had it already been. And here's why: because if if uh, if uh, if it's early on and the brain is very plastic and very malleable and very adaptive, and if you damage an area of the brain, like let's say Wernicke's area, which is language comprehension, let's say the kid gets it in the left temporal cortex and left temporal lobe, and it damages Wernicke's area, which is for language comprehension, an area near it, adjacent to it, will pick up the responsibility. The neurons will say, all right, well, we need it, so we'll use this over here. But if it's later and that area that is adjacent to it, where it should have been, Wernicke's area, it's already been specialized for something. So it's more difficult for another area to take over a responsibility or a function after it's already been delegated to do something. Like, oh no, I'm for you know, this, I'm already delegated to be responsible for tone and or pitch and timbre. Like I'm supposed to pick up on the unique qualities of sound, and now you want me to understand language. That's something different. So the age at the time of injury, the site and severity of damage, and the skill area that's affected. You know, if it's a very complex skill, it's harder for a different region that's supposed to be responsible for something else. It's more difficult for them to pick up for it.
Is this some of the reason you get like the savant syndrome with like autism kids and stuff like that? Is it like
Go on.
brain being wired a certain ways
Yes.
all the way from birth because other parts of the brain aren't going to function the same? This is where I'm going to get the no, isn't it?
No, you're not wrong. I would just word it differently because it almost sounds like parts of the brain aren't functioning properly and they're adopting other skills. It's not exactly what's happened. So we have all of this early on. I'm gonna go back up. We have look at all this here. All of these synapses form. Now watch what happens. They drop. They drop. That's called synaptic pruning. People diagnosed on the spectrum, they don't drop. Those synapses remain. So that means there's all these neurons that have been set up, organized to learn something. And then once they've learned the skill, they pull back on the number of connections because we don't need that many. We've figured it out. We don't need extras. Well, people diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, those synapses don't prune away. So when it comes to the savantism, what's happening is they're able to use more synapses. They're able to use more neural firing to understand complex things faster. But as a result, there's a confusion and there's a sacrifice in being able to quiet them down. They can't quiet them down. And when they don't quiet them down, it leads to behavior consequences like the social deficits or the hypersensitivities like to sound, to touch, to taste, to sight, right? They're hypersensitive to stimuli. And as a result, it leads to some behavioral deficits like a social deficit. It's too much stimulation. Yeah, you get it. That's one of the raddest things
Yeah.
about psychology is you think you understand it, you think, okay, that makes sense. Then there must be that a part of the brain isn't wired right and other parts are overwired, when in fact it's other parts are wired correctly. It's just that the other parts are still overwired. So let's think of it this way too. So I just described that, okay, so if you don't have neurons to solve a math problem, if you're lacking these neurons, you're not gonna be able to solve a math problem, right? Makes sense. That's true, right? Okay. Or how about this? It's gonna be easier. If you don't have the neurons in the occipital lobe to perceive sight, you're not gonna see. You'll be blind, right? That's easy. Yes. I'm looking at Patrick. He's the only one I can see. So I'm going to look to you. Okay. So if you're missing neurons for a function, you're not going to have that function, right? Yes, is the answer. Are you there with me? Patrick.
Barely. I'm breaking up.
Okay. So I'm breaking up?
Yeah. I don't know if that's probably my computer. I got like the kids are probably on something. I'm gonna have
Okay.
to go yell.
Okay. All right. Okay. I'll just try to go through it. All right. Hopefully it's not on my end. If you don't have eyes, you won't see. If you do, good. Then you can send the messages from what is stimulating your eyes to the back of the brain to be perceived. Okay, good. If you don't have the neurons in the back of the brain to perceive it, then you're still going to be blind. Okay, that's not good. All right. So we know that with neurons come function, come capacity, abilities, skills. We don't have those neurons. We don't have those skills, those abilities. So it would reason then that the more neurons you have for like solving a problem, the better you are at solving the problem. So that's what they hypothesized for years. Why was literally they looked at Albert Einstein's brain when he died. They took his brain and studied it, like his physical brain. And they were all guessing he must have a lot of neurons. He must have more neurons than the average person. You know what it was, though? It wasn't neurons. It wasn't the number of neurons. It was the number of glial cells. You're like, what are you talking about? So in the beginning of this lecture, we were talking about myelinization. We were talking about these specific kinds of glial cells called myelin cells that will wrap themselves around like a link around an axon to speed up neural firing. What they found was that Albert Einstein didn't have any more neurons than the average human being, but he had a lot of glial cells, more glial cells than the average human being. And so what glial cells do, there are many functions of them, but I nickname them, or I call them the mother cells, because they feed the neurons, they take away waste of the neurons, they support the neurons, as in like help hold its structure. They protect the neurons, as in like help it not become damaged. They're like the mothers. And so Albert Einstein was so smart and so intuitive and ingenious, not because of the number of neurons he had, but the number of cells that helped his neurons be efficient. So what does all this mean? Why am I even saying all this? I'm saying it because in psychology, we'll ask a question. In the discipline of psychology, we'll ask a question and we'll think we'll have the answer, and then someone will find something that explains it in a completely unexpected way, just like autism. Okay. So if the healthy regions assume the functions of a damaged region or area, we have what's called the crowding effect. Right? There's too many functions in an area that's supposed to be delegated to maybe one or two. Now it's responsible for 3 or 4. Okay. So as a result, complex mental abilities will suffer. So the recovery from an injury, it's greater for language than for spatial skills, meaning if you damage a part of your right hemisphere, your ability to understand things in space don't recover as easily as something like language in your left hemisphere. Practicing relevant skills or tasks rather build and strengthen the synapse. So practice, keep firing the neurons to make more synapses and so on and so forth. But it's limited if it's widespread damage or if it's in certain regions like the prefrontal cortex. Other regions cannot compensate for that. Sensitive periods in brain development. We need appropriate stimulation, and that it's vital for our brain to grow. So we're hypersensitive to things like sound after we're born, right? So we have all these synapses being formed, and we're hypersensitive because our brain is organizing, it's getting ready for us to use to activate this region. And so as a result, we are soaking. They say children are like sponges when it comes to language. They hear it once, right? And they can remember a word. Maybe they don't put it out, as well, or maybe not even correctly, but they remember this word. Early extreme sensory deprivation results in permanent brain damage and even loss of function. So if you don't expose a child to sight for the first, to light or whatever for the first few years, they will not develop sight. So rushing early learning overwhelms the neural circuits and impedes the brain's potential. Let me check something. Give me 1 second, sorry. Okay, we're good. Okay, all right. Just want to make sure we are. Okay. Another role, like this is just emphasizing the role of our environment on our development. In this case, our cognitive development. In the study, they looked at 6 and 11-year-olds who were adopted from British and Romanian orphanages. They found out when they were adopted, at what age they were adopted from the orphanage. And then at the ages of 6 and the age of 11, they looked at their IQ. And what they found was that in the British orphanage, if they were adopted before they turned 6 months old, their IQs were above average. Romanian orphanage, the IQ for the 6-year-olds at that age were above average. By 11, they were just average. If they were adopted sometime between the age of 6 months and 2 years, they were well below average, both at the 6 and 11 years old. If they were adopted after 2 years to 3.5 years, if they were in that range, it dropped even further. What does this show you? What are we learning from this? Why does the age at which you are adopted have an impact on your IQ?
Is it like the nature versus nurture argument? Does it have to do with that? Because probably because when they're younger and they probably don't have stability, so their brain's not really focused on developing those glial cells and neurons and stuff. It's probably more focused on just trying to cope with the stresses of living in an orphanage or maybe being passed around from different families. So it's not like a priority.
Okay, good. All of that is correct. So what do you imagine an orphanage to look like? What's your schema for, let's say, an orphanage in 1950?
They're not going to have a lot of like contact with people or stimulation.
Correct. They're not going to be stimulated. Correct. It is one person. It's like being in a daycare all day, every day. That's your life. It's one person for, let's say, even 6 children. It's probably more than that. Okay. So that individual to child ratio is huge. And they're not getting that stimulation. They're not getting that contact. They're not getting that attention that we need. We are a social species. So that's what they're speaking to. But let me ask you a question. This is an exercise in critical thinking now. What if it weren't that? Let's say you don't believe it. Let's say you were against that idea, that you don't think that, attention and contact and stimulation or parts of the environment are important for, cognitive development. What could you say would be like another cause of it? Pretend that you are against the idea and you say, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but it could also be this.
Maybe that you're not being like mentally stimulated.
Well, that's the argument. Now you want to counter that argument and say, no, it's not that. It's actually this, or it could be this. What else could, if you were to tell a story and you know the story is this: children who were tested, their IQs were tested, they were different, and it was correlated with the age at which they were adopted. We would call that a negative correlation. So more time in an orphanage, lower IQ. So what could be an explanation for that?
Maybe.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Maybe about like the food they eat.
Good. That's a good guess. In fact, I didn't even think of that, and you're absolutely right. That could absolutely be a contributing factor. What's another one? That was good, Emily.
I was gonna say maybe the lack of consistency with like a paternal figure. Like,
Okay, good. I didn't even think of that one either. That typically in an orphanage, you'd have mostly women taking care of these things, of these babies, toddlers and infants. Maybe it's because they don't have access or exposure to males, and how somehow that has an impact. That's good too. What's another thing? I like that.
What about the stress of being in that environment?
Okay, so what if it's not good? What if it has nothing to do with them being stimulated in a positive way? What if it's just a stressful environment, lots of noise, lots of movement, lots of like just the stress itself, the dynamics of the environment? Yes, good. This is critical thinking. This is an exercise in practicing problem solving, seeking alternatives, and coming up eventually to reach a defensible conclusion. To say, okay, I've considered the environment, I've considered the parents, the fathers or the males, I've considered the nutrition. Good. What about this? And maybe this one's like way, outside of the box. What if it has nothing to do with the time, or I should say the age at which they're adopted? What if the ones who are adopted later are less desirable? Think about when you go to a shelter, a thing, wherever you get a dog or a cat. And think of like a litter of dogs, of puppies, or whatever, a thing of kittens. There's always going to be ones that are cuter than the others. There's always going to be ones more attractive. Oh, I like that one. That one's got a nice picture of Jesus on its chest. Something that is appealing, that we might all think similarly about. Oh, I like that one. That one's got, all of them have brown eyes, but that one's got like this really bright blue. I want that. It's a unique, just novelty. What if it was something about the children? What if the children who were being adopted later didn't look a certain way? What if they already were cognitively depressed? Now, that's not the answer, I'm going to tell you right now. But the reason why I'm saying that, the reason why I'm telling you, is because some things sometimes we'll look at data, we'll look at results, and we'll go, well, this caused this. But what if it was the actual reverse? What if it wasn't the egg to the chicken? What if it was the chicken to the egg? And so what if it wasn't the exposure to the environment, or being in that environment led to a lower IQ? What if it was a lower IQ led them to being in there longer? It's not true, but it's just an exercise in thinking. That's all it is. All right, I'm going to stop recording. I'm fine with today.